Having fun isn't hard when you've got a library card. Hello and welcome back to My Tech Wardrobe. My name is Caitlin and I make fashion related videos every Friday. I wanted to have a bit cozier of a video this week. I just wanted to sort of cozy up and have a nice little book chat because I have been quite the bookworm this month. I've read 9 books so far this year of 2022 and I'm feeling pretty proud of myself. Like, I'm no booktuber, but I don't know, I feel good about it. So today I just wanted to have an old-fashioned book chat with you and talk about some of the books that are related to fashion that I have really enjoyed reading and that I think you might too. This is going to be a mix of fiction and nonfiction books, so we're going to start with the nonfiction. Now, there is a functionally massive list of fashion-related books out there in the world, so this is in no way meant to be a comprehensive guide to books on fashion, and in fact, you're not really going to find a lot of information about the famous fashion houses like Dior and Chanel in here. I'm really just sticking to what I like and what I've read so far. So my goal with this video is that even if you just find one book that you might be interested in reading, then I've done my job. First is this one, The Conscious Closet by Elizabeth L. Klein. And this is one I picked up literally March 2020. And I didn't think I would have time to read it because I was previously extremely busy and never home. But as we know, 2020, I had some free time. The full title is The Conscious Closet, The Revolutionary Guide to Looking Good While Doing Good. And this is all about creating a sustainable wardrobe or closet for yourself. And despite the size, it looks a bit like a novel. It is jam-packed with information. It's not only just a style guide, so how to find consciously made and sustainably made pieces, but also how to shop secondhand and vintage in a very strategic and smart way. What I really appreciated about this book is the high level of detail behind what goes into your clothes. So it has many sections about the actual textiles that we wear and that are included typically in fast fashion and what that actually means when you're done with those types of textiles. So as an example, she talks about materials like polyester and nylon and how those are not necessarily natural materials that are going to biodegrade when you're done with them. So when you are done with them and you throw them away or you donate them, what actually happens? And spoiler alert, it's not good. So this book really changed my perspective on fast fashion. Not that I was obsessed with fast fashion before, but it really does get into the true cost of fast fashion itself and some really helpful alternatives that are realistic. So she's not just advocating to buy only sustainably made goods that are very, very expensive. She really talks about what might be an option for you according to your budget, how to dispose of your used clothing effectively, so whether you donate or find another method of textile recycling. I highly recommend this one because it's not very long, but it's got a really excellent resources section. Yeah, a good pretty much 30 pages is the bibliography and citations section. So as a former history graduate student, I really appreciate that level of detail. Next in nonfiction, a tiny but heavy book. This book is called Fashion History, 18th to the 20th Century, and it is published by the Kyoto Costume Institute in Japan. This is a really interesting book because when you open it up, it almost looks like it should be a coffee table book, but it's mini. This is my head. This is the book. Not very big. What I really like about this is that it's written by the curators of a lot of the exhibits related to the Costume Institute. So They provide a very detailed synopsis at the beginning of each chapter on the respective eras that they're talking about. So they start, obviously, as the title would suggest, in the 18th century, and they get really detailed about the very specific changes in fashion over time. And what's really great about this is that it could be kind of dry reading, but what I find really exciting about it is that it's essentially a pocket-sized reference book. It has some of the most beautifully posed mannequins and photos and details that I have ever seen in a book of this size. And I'm learning fun facts along the way about the Kyoto Costume Institute, including the fact that they help develop their own mannequins depending on the era of clothing that they're hoping to exhibit, because body types change over time. And that's what the clothing of history is adapted to. So what they did was take a really detailed look into what may have been appropriate at the time and started to co-create actual new types of mannequins to display the clothing in an effective way, and essentially to evoke movement and to make these garments that would traditionally just lie flat for you to look at them come to life in the Costume Institute. And I just thought that was so interesting. So if you're looking for a really interesting coffee table book, maybe if you have a small coffee table, this one's for you. But if you're also looking for excellent photos, close-ups of textiles that you don't really see very often, this is a really great reference book. And it actually has a glossary of important designers over time and just the garments themselves. Like I learned what a cannelé is. It is a weave with a channeled or fluted surface produced by continuous loops of warp thread, a typical French fabric of the 18th century. Did you know that? I didn't. Next, again in no particular order, you saw this book in my Fashion History Museum video where I purchased it at the museum, but this is Great War Fashion: Tales from the History of Wardrobe by Lucy Adlington. Now this book was very interesting to me because, again, I thought it would be pretty dry, but the photography throughout is excellent. The level of detail is pretty exquisite. They use both archival advertising material and items from the author's personal collection so that you can see what this period of time's clothing looks like on an actual body. And for those of you who aren't aware, the Great War happened between 1914 and 1919. So we're looking at sort of the beginning of the 20th century. But this book covers just before and just after. So it talks about things like maternity wear and maternity corsets. It talks about women in sports and all of these other areas in which women's fashion don't tend to go into that often. So when you think of Great War fashion, you sort of think of maybe beige, brown, long dresses, high necks, almost Victorian in style, but it actually wasn't like that at all. There are so many more nuances, and I think Lucy Adlington does a really good job of unpacking each of those. So I really enjoyed reading this, and I think you would too. Next in nonfiction, What Would Audrey Do by Pamela Kyo? You tell me. Now this is not an Audrey fashion book entirely. This is meant to be an all-encompassing look into how Audrey Hepburn would have approached any particular situation in her life. So it details sort of her as a movie star, her as a mother, how she would go to parties and how she would interact with people on the road, talks about her romantic life, some heartbreaks that she felt, her charitable work with UNICEF. So there's a lot in here, and I think what's most interesting to me though, and why it's on this list for me, is because there is an entire chapter on Audrey's style. Now you can read literally any book in the world on Audrey Hepburn, and there's going to be a significant section on Audrey's style. But I thought this book was good because it isn't too long and it doesn't have to be that specific. It sort of walks you through a list of must-have items that Audrey would consider really important to her type of wardrobe. It goes through a typical Audrey makeup look, which actually I did use in my Audrey Hepburn style video. I used it on myself. So if you're looking for tips there, you can go ahead and watch that video. This is also a pretty interesting glimpse into how Audrey viewed herself as well. The book references a 1953 interview between Audrey and Hedda Hopper, who was a famous columnist at the time. And this is when Audrey was sort of a couple of years into her Hollywood career. And essentially she talked about some of her insecurities related to her shoulders. She thought they were too broad. She wanted sort of sloping shoulders, more like Vivian Leigh. And Audrey in that article is quoted as saying, "I don't think I'm at all beautiful. And I'm not fishing, I mean it." So I think it's just an interesting glimpse into the fact that one of the most famous women in the world at the time and now didn't think she was that beautiful and didn't think her style was anything particularly revolutionary or interesting. And I think that is a very interesting concept because there are some lessons to be taken from that. You know, the way that we see ourselves is not necessarily at all how others see us. And usually any of our negative perceptions about ourselves and our appearance and our style are typically not shared by others. And if Audrey Hepburn can't convince you of that, I don't know who can. And last up on the nonfiction, How to Not Wear Black, Find Your Style and Create Your Forever Wardrobe by Anna Murphy. I am pretty adamant about finding your own personal style in a way that actually works for you. And I wasn't expecting this book to give me really anything that I didn't already know, but I wanted to understand how Anna Murphy specifically laid this out. She's the fashion director at the Times of London, so I thought, she's got some credentials, let's see what she's got. And actually, although this is still a very high-level primer, I think it's really good for people who really are developing their personal style from absolute scratch. So they've got information in here about how to deal with fashion trends, how to choose the right colors and patterns for you, how to boost up the basics. So if you're gonna wear black, and if you're gonna try to wear something very classic, here's how to elevate it a little bit and make it more interesting. There's a lot to be said for just a simple, well thought out read. And that's what this is. So if I were to recommend any of these books today as a way for you to just start from scratch, it would be to start with this book. The whole section on how to buy jeans, even down to the science of pockets. So if you want your booty to look a certain way, you gotta choose the right pocket. Next is novels. There are only technically, I guess there are technically 4 here, but one is a series, so I'm gonna count these as 2. First is The Vintage Guide to Love and Romance by Kirsty Greenwood. And I have not reread this book in a very long time, but when I read it the first time, I just fell in love with the universe of it. And it centers around a girl named Jessica Beam. She lives in London. She's a bit of a party girl, sort of the typical hot mess girl that you would see in a lot of rom-coms and a lot of TV shows centered around, you know, love and romance. Jessica Beam essentially gets evicted from her flat and she needs a place to live, so she reconnects with her long-lost grandmother named Matilda Beam, who wrote a series of good woman sort of self-help guidebooks in the 1950s. She's facing a little bit of turmoil because her books are out of print, she has no other income source, and she's having a hard time making ends meet. So when these two connect, an interesting opportunity arises to sort of revitalize this series of self-help books that she wrote from the 1950s. And now they're looking to modernize it based on her granddaughter, Jessica. So essentially, this is just a book that is full of really fun, fluffy makeover scenes, but not in a way that you would expect. So they really go full on into making a vintage lady modern. And this is a good example of how mixing vintage style doesn't necessarily equate to having vintage values. So there's some bullet bras, and if you don't know what bullet bras are, just Google it. It's a lot of fun. I just think it's a really fun romp into vintage style. It's a really fun family love, reconnection type of story. It's very heartwarming and the characters are really funny. So if you're looking for just something really fluffy that has vintage clothes as a focus, this is a good one. Last in the list, this series by Lucy Holiday. I call them the Night In series because it has 3 books in the series and it's a trilogy. And it's a night in with Audrey Hepburn, a night in with Marilyn Monroe, and a night in with Grace Kelly. And these are my comfort books. You know how you just have those books that you read maybe once or twice a year, and they remind you of something very specific, and you hold on to them for that reason, and they always give you the warm and fuzzies. These are those books for me. So the premise is that a girl named Libby Lomax lives in London. Wow, is that an alliteration? But again, typical hot mess story. She's just having a really rough time. She's pursued being an actress. It's not really working out. She's stressed, she's tired, she's had to move into a new flat. All of a sudden, as she's unpacking after a horrible day, Audrey Hepburn herself appears on her vintage sofa in the middle of her flat. Why? We don't know. It's a mystery. But what's really great about this series is that all of these apparitions, maybe, of Audrey, Marilyn, and Grace that happen in each book teach Libby something about what she needs to do to really get her life back on track or start living the life that brings her joy and interests her and excites her. So these books are really fun because Libby starts to dabble in jewelry design. She's really interested in creative and fashion type work, so you get that a lot in these books. But with each of these very famous and glamorous movie stars, of course, come very detailed descriptions of their outfits. So if you were to suddenly have one of them appear in the middle of your flat as a real human being, you would look to see what the texture of their clothing actually is, what the glasses rim looks like up close. So for example, there's one sequence in which Audrey turns up in the famous Breakfast at Tiffany's dress, the very long Givenchy sort of tight-fitting, beautiful black dress with her very big tortoiseshell green sunglasses from the opening scene in Breakfast at Tiffany's. Now, the author goes into detail about what it would be like to see those things actually up close in person. And I think it's just such a nice way to humanize these people, but also their clothing as well, because you can see that clothing in museums now, you can watch it on film, but you don't get this sort of visceral first-person reaction to those items of clothing. So I think this is just a really fun, fictionalized way to do that. And I think it's sort of escapism at its best. So highly, highly recommend this series if you can find it. I've noticed it's kind of been out of print lately, at least in Canada where I'm from. So copies though are probably available online. So if you see them, get some, because they're really interesting. And they're just really fun, quick reads. No one I know has read these specific books, so I haven't actually been able to talk about them with anyone. So if you read them, or if you have, please let me know in the comments below and we can talk about them. And if there are any other fashion books that you really, really love and think other people should know about, let me know in the comments, because I'm always looking for a good read. And I'm always looking for a fashion read in particular. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, why not subscribe? And if you didn't like it, subscribe anyway, because it will be different next time. Bye. Oh.